We're on Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis, and yesterday we began with Tnan Hasam, which is the third of the wide lines, and we quoted a Mishnah Megillah and a question that Rish Lakish addressed to Rabbi Yochanan. In the Mishnah Megillah, we have various days in Adar that are designated for the Kriya of Megillah. So Rish Lakish turns to Rabbi Yochanan, he says, isn't this a violation of Lotus Godedu? And this Lotus Godedu tells me that you're not allowed to make a Chabura al Ames. However, if the Torah just wanted to teach me that you're not allowed to make a Chabura al Ames, then why did the Torah say Lotus Godedu, which implies a Gedida and a Chabura? It could have said lo ti godedu. Why did it have to say lo tis godedu? And shma midol lahachla hudiyasa. So that the extra tough is teaching me that you're not allowed to create what we call agudos. And the Gemara says v'yema kule. Maybe the pasuk is only coming for agudos lahachi hudiyasa. That's what it's teaching me, but it does not prohibit chabur al ames, and came lema kro lo tagodu. It could have said lo tagodu means that you're not allowed to make agudos. My lo tis godedu shma mina tarti. So from the fact that it doesn't say lo to godedu, or lo tis godedu, and from the fact that it doesn't say lo tagodu, but rather lo tis godedu, we derive two halachas. One is that you're not allowed to make a chabur al ames, and the other is that you are not allowed to create agudos. So now Reish Lakish turns to Rabbi Yochanan and he says, how do we justify the Mishnah in Masechet Megillah? After all, how can you set up different moadim for different communities and different locations for Kriyas HaMegillah? You're in effect creating a tzibur breaking down a tzibur into agudos. Amalei, so Rabbi Yochanan responds to Reish Lakish, Ad kan lo shad nisa. This Mishnah at the beginning of Megillah, it only talks about chiluke minog bein makom echel b'shneu. On this Mishnah in Masechta Megillah, it doesn't say that there are chiluke minhagim, like for example, in Makom Shenagu, in Psachim Dafnun, it says Makom Shenagu lasas v'lach b'arvei Psachim ad chatzos osin, Makom Shenagu shelo lasos eina osin. So you see already with regard to Asiyas Malach and Erev Pesach, it changes from one place to another place, and there's no violation of Lotus Godu. That didn't bother you, Rish. You're bothered by the Mishnah Megillah. Why are you asking me from the Mishnah Megillah? You could ask me from the Mishnah Psachim. Amalei, Rish Lakish says in response to Rabbi Yochanan, Mina l'chana isura. Ani amarti lahachshos mismane kriya Megillah b'dafka. Why did I ask for the Mishnah Megillah? Because the Bnei Ayaros are not allowed to read on the 15th. And the Bnei HaKrachim are not allowed to read on the 14th. So the Chacham will kovei different zmanim for the Krachim and for the Bnei Ayaros. The Amar Rav Shemen Bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan. What does it mean at the end of Megillah? It says L'kayim Esimei Apurim Bizmanehem, and the word Bizmanehem is in the plural. Zmanim Harbe Tiknu Lahem Chachamim, which means that these read on the 14th, and these read on the 15th. And you're not allowed to switch it around. The Amali, you're asking me minhaga. There are chiluki minhagim for sure. Every place, every community, every location has its own minhag. And when you divide up into minhagim, that doesn't look like the Torah is divided into two Torahs with agudos. But it means that as far as the strict letter of the law, we agree that it's mutter. We took on a minhag, the chumrah. And the minhag l'chumrah is acceptable, and that's not a violation of agudas. But when you're making a takana based on a pasuk in Megillus Esther, bismanehem, that these will read on this day and these on that day, that's Torah, that's 2 Torahs. That's not a matter of minhag. So Rabbi Yochanan responds, Chasam, with regard to Asiyas Malach and Erev Pesach, Lavi Surei Hava. Are you telling me that it's not a matter of Isur? It's only, you can reduce it only to minhag? But Tanan, we have a Mishnah with regard to Malacha that says Halayla, the night of B'dikas Chametz, which means Orli Dalid, Ben Nisan. Yeah, we just started. You want to join? Just bring it in. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I didn't go outside to look. Yeah. Okay, so Jeff, I'll just very quickly review the main highlights for Jeff. He was actually sitting outside, didn't realize we were giving the shir inside. So Jeff, you have to move the table like this. And once again, I want to warn you that the internet is very unreliable. In the previous shir, the internet went down in the middle. Which reminds me, by the way, John, write down something called you have a pen?
Yes, I do.
If you could write down a personal meeting ID, which means that if, let's say, it really gets cut off, I'm going to use my phone, and this happened to me yesterday. So you can write down a personal meeting ID. Let me know if you want me to send it to you by WhatsApp. 660-560-4816. So that's for Shas Chak. If I have to open up a new meeting that's not scheduled, and I can do that on my phone. So Jeff, just to clue you in, we're talking about the issue of Malach on Erev Pesach, on the 14th of Nisan. And Reish Lakish understood that that was a question of minhag, meaning according to the strict letter of the law, you're allowed to do malacha on Erev Pesach. The Torah didn't prohibit malacha on Erev Pesach. There were those locations, those areas that took upon themselves a special minhag, l'chumra. And that's not a violation of what's called Mirakish Te Toros, Agudos. Comes along Rabbi Yochanan, and he quotes a different Mishnah, and he's going to analyze that Mishnah and come to a different conclusion about the Isur Malacha on Erev Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. It's not just a matter of minhag. We accepted a chum. So if you're on Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis, all the way on the bottom, you will see 3 lines up from the bottom. Hasam Lavi Suri Avyoka, question mark, is the issue of Malacha, the Isur of Malacha on Erev Pesach, just a matter of minhag? It's not a matter of Isur in a rhetorical question. But Tanan, we have a Mishnah that says, Halayla, on the night of what we call Or Le'arbosar, this is a full 24 hours before Pesach, Beit Shammai Osrim, Ubeis Hillel Matirim. Beit Shammai says you're not allowed to engage in malacha. Right now you have one and only one responsibility, and that is B'dikas Chametz. There's no room for malacha, for getting distracted with malacha. Ubeis Hillel Matirim, Beis Hillel say, it's fine. The Gemara is going to say in Masechet Psachim that there are different minhagim about this business. In any event, we see that the issue of malacha on Erev Pesach, at least as far as the night going into Erev Pesach is concerned, is not just a matter of minhag, but rather it's a question of Isur. And according to Beit Shammai, we have an Isur. I'll give you an example, Rabosa. You're not allowed to eat before davening. That's not a minhag, that's an Isur. You're not allowed to eat before B'dikas Chametz, according to Beit Shammai, that's an Isur. Now, Beis Hillel were matir. They allowed you to do malach on the night of Erev Pesach, despite the chiyuv b'dika. And we have now 2 different traditions splitting the tzibur into 2, with regard to an Easter, not with regard just to a minute. When Beit Shammai said that you're not allowed to do malacha on Erev Pesach, they weren't talking about a minute. They weren't talking about a self-imposed chumrah. B'dikas chametz as an obligation generates an Easter malacha. Beis Hill says no. So we have two traditions, and the tradition spilled into Erev Pesach in the morning, the 14th. And one tradition was, like Beit Shammai, on the night of Erev Pesach, that we abstain from malacha on the day of Erev Pesach. And Yud Daled is taken as one Zman, as one uninterrupted, indivisible entity, one unit of time. Beis Hill, on the other hand, says there's no Isur Malacha on Erev Pesach. And the Mishnah says that there are those makomos where they're noig like Beit Shammai, and those where they're noig like Beis Hillel. Why don't you get upset about that, Reish Lakish? That should also become a violation of Lotus Kodedu. Reish Lakish says, I'm still not bothered by that, by the issue of Erev Malacha, of Isur Malacha and Erev Pesach. Hassan, what kind of Isur are you dealing with? You're dealing with a case where someone abstains from malacha. Why? Because he reflects that shita l'chumra of Beit Shammai. No. You know why he's not doing malacha? Because he's a lazy bones, or because he's working from home on Zoom. I don't know why. Hasam haroeh omer malacha u'deleslan. He has no malacha now. But in the case of Megillah, you can't say less like malacha. You know, Megillah, this group is obligated to read on the 14th of Adar, and this group on the 15th of Adar. That's a violation of Lotus Kodedu. Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan, I'm reading the Masechet. He says, you can't tell me that Shinui Anhaga amongst different parts of the tzibur is prohibited under the Isur Lav of Lotus Kodedu. Beit Shammai matir matzoros li'achim u'Beis Hillel osrim. Beit Shammai, as recorded in our Mishnah here in Yevamos, on Daf Yud Gimel, is of the opinion that a tzoras erva falls for Yibum. He never accepted litzvah. And Beis Hillel say no. And the Talmidim of Beit Shammai were knowing like Beit Shammai. The Talmidim of Beis Hillel like Beis Hillel. So you see that you could have two different minhagim that split the tzibur of Klal Yisrael without a violation of Lotus Kodedu. In other words, you see that you could have a situation where, based on a psak of one particular Morah Hora, in a certain area, they are makel lematra. Based on a psak of a different Morah Hora, they could be machmir. And again, according to you, Reish Lakish, the same way you're objecting to the Mishnah in Megillah, you should be objecting to our Mishnah here in Yevamos. How can we allow that in one area of the world we're going to follow Beit Shammai and a tzoras erva will fall for Yibum, and in another area of the world we're going to follow Beis Hillel and a tzoras erva is like an erva? So now the ball again is in Reish Lakish's court. How is he going to resolve the issue of tzoras erva, Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai, the different traditions and customs? And now we turn to Daf Yud Daled. You're of the opinion, Rabbi Yochanan, that Lamaisa, the entire school of thought, and all the disciples and Talmidim of Beit Shammai, they followed the ruling of Beit Shammai, and they instituted Yibum in the case of Tzoras Erva. That's not so. Lo also Beit Shammai Kidivreim. The halacha was paskined and accepted like Beis Hillel. And even the school of Beit Shammai accepted the final ruling, the verdict, like Beis Hillel. And they were not miyabim the tzaros. And all this, says Reish Lakish, is because of agudos, lotasu agudos. We can't split Klal Yisrael into half. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, He disagrees. Also, Beit Shammai followed Beit Shammai, and they implemented the Horah, the Psak of Beit Shammai, and they had Yibum in the case of Itzaras Erba. They weren't afraid of Lotus Goladu. And therefore, if you have a drush of Lotus Goladu, Lotasu Agudas Agudos, forget about asking me a kasha from Megillah, ask me a kasha from Yibum of Itzaras Erba. The Gemara clarifies. Beplugta de Rav Ushmuel. The machlokes here between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is identical with the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. The Rav Omer lo osu Beit Shammai kedivreim. According to Rav, Beit Shammai Lamaisa were knowing like Beis Hillel, and they did not allow for Yibum in the case of Itzaras Erba. Shmuel Omer osu v'osu. The Talmidim of Beit Shammai, the entire legacy of the school of Beit Shammai, would implement Beit Shammai's ruling, halacha l'maisa, and it would be Yibum of Itzaras Erba. Now the Gemara is bothered by a baskel. The Gemara in Eruvin on Daf Yud Gimel records that a heavenly voice declared that whenever there's a machlokes in Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai would pass like Beis Hillel. Amos. Let's analyze the machlokes here between, on the one side of the scorecard, Rav and Reish Lakish, and on the other side of the scorecard, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, whether or not Beit Shammai did, and they followed like the psak of their Rebbe Shammai Azor. Elam, if you're going to tell me that this entire machlokes was Kodem Baskol, it was before the heavenly voice declared that the halacha is always like Beis Hillel. Is my time in the Mandi Amalo awesome? Why should you assume? There's no rhyme or reason to assume that the Talmidim of Beit Shammai would not implement Tzoras, Yibum of a Tzoras Erba. So what do we do with Reish Lakish, and for that matter with Rav? Lo asu Beit Shammai kidivreim. Why not? There was no clear-cut indication that we pass like this. V'ela, then by process of elimination, you can tell me Sliachar Baskol that school of thought of Reish Lakish and Rav, they maintained that Beis Shammai did not implement Yibum L'maisa in a case of Tzaras Erba. That's because they were after the Baskol. We passed like Beis Hillel. The halach was accepted like Beis Hillel. Is my time in demand the also? What are you going to do with the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan and for that matter Shmuel, that the Talmid of Beit Shammai actually implemented the halacha of Tzoras, Yibum, Tzoras Erba? Why? I mean, there was a Baskol. Did they not hear the Baskol? I can give you two approaches to answer this problem. One is Kodem Baskol, Ibois Ema Lachim Baskol. Ibois Ema Kodem Baskol. And now you're telling me that if it's before the Baskol, I don't understand that shita, that the Talmidim of Beit Shammai did not implement the psak of their Rebbe. Ukigon, the Beis Hillel Ruba, and a time period in which Beis Hillel became the Rov and Beit Shammai the Miut, and we have a halacha of Hazlina Basar Ruba, that we paskin and we rule a verdict according to the Rov. And once Beis Hillel established themselves as the Rov, then at that point, the Talmidim of Beit Shammai had to accept the halacha like Beis Hillel, and therefore lo asu, even though it was before Baskol. Islamandi Omer lo asu, Beit Shammai could not continue to allow for Yibum in its Tzoras Erba because now we have a Rov of Beis Hillel. That's the Ha Beis Hillel Ruba. Oh, but now we're stuck. What about the other Mandi Omer that says that Beis Hillel continued in their ways and they did implement a Yibum situation in Tzoras Erba despite the fact that Beis Hillel is the Rov? And the Omer asu. It's a very, very famous Gemara. There's an advantage to Beis Hillel But there's a counter advantage on the other side of the scorecard to Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel has the rove, which you would call kamuth, and Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai have what's called machadede. That's echus. And the assumption is that Beis Shammai was sharper than Beis Hillel. Now, again, how you'd make that evaluation, I do not know. Only the Gemara can make such an evaluation. It's very interesting that even though the normative psak halacha is like Beis Hillel, based on the rule of Rome, but nevertheless, if you ask me who's closer to emes, who's closer to the truth, it's paradoxically Beit Shammai. So that's one approach in our Gemara. We're talking about Kodem Paschal, and the reason why, according to one shita, they ceased or desisted from implementing Beit Shammai if it's before the Paschal is because of Rove, and the other mind, the Omer says no, they pulled out. I'm sorry, they didn't pull out despite the Rove. They continued to follow in the footsteps of Beit Shammai, despite the fact that Beit Shammai is now the miut, because of a different rule, and that's called Machadedei Iboy Seimo Liachar Bas. Alabadi Overlo Osu Danafka Baska. Now we have a clear-cut verdict in favor of Beis Hillel, and therefore lo Osu. Umandi Amar Osu. Why would they continue following in Beit Shammai's footsteps even after the Paschal? The answer is Rabbi Yeshua Hidi Omer Mashkichin beBaschal. This is the famous sugya, if you've heard of it, of Tanur Shalach Noah, right? So what happened was, it was Machlokes, Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Loza, whether it be Matami the Tanur, and Rabbi Loza says, I'm going to prove to you that I'm right because the Paschal is going to come down from Shamayim and declare halacha to Rabbi Loza. But Rabbi Yeshua says, hey, mashkichim beBaschal. The halacha is not in Shamayim, the halacha is here. An unbelievable revolution. We always think that the whole purpose of Torah is to try to figure out the will of God. So here you have a Paschal. I mean, that's clearly the will of God. No. When it comes to Psak Halacha, it's down here on earth. The reins have been given over to the Chacham. And that's called Lo Bashamayim. I remember from my days in Keren B'Av, the Tovshin Lamed, Rav Goldberg Zichron Levrach used to talk a lot about this Gemara. And I think it's published in the Marachos, Asufas Marachos. I have to find it because I don't know how many volumes there are. But he used to always point out that when it comes to interpreting the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu defeated the Malach. Do you remember the Gemara says in Shabbos Pei Chesed, there was a gigantic debate on high, and the Malachim said, why are you giving the Torah down on earth? Let's keep the Torah here up in the angelic celestial Shamayim. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu appointed Moshe, and he says to them, hold on to my kisei covenant and argue against them. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, well, klum yetzahar yesh b'yedchem, lo sirtzach, lo sinof, lo sachmod. I mean, none of these Yisurim apply to you. So Rav Goldberg used to ask, so what kind of a winning argument is that? And the answer is that the Torah has to fit the human nature. And Lo Bashamayim, he means that the Torah is not just some sort of body of abstract rules and determinations of Allah. It's got to be down here on earth. It's klum shebadatem mitzrayim, or you meshubadim mitzrayim, the Sovi Psukim. And the Malachim live in a world of disembodied spirits. For them, Torah could be seen in a pure intellectual, conceptual way, abstract, completely disconnected with the earth, with the physical, material, and Yetzer Hara world that we live in. But the Torah was given for man, and I'll prove it to you, says Moshe Rabbeinu, because it says lo sigzol and lo sirtzach. There's no ritzich up in Shemaim. In other words, in Malach Hasharis, you might have an abstract concept, and perhaps we're going to paskin in Shemaim like Rabbi Lazar. But as far as lo b'shamayim, as far as the earth is concerned, the Torah has to be interpreted and understood the way the human being will interpret it, because the Torah was given to be appropriate and fit with the human condition. There's more to it than that, but Rav Goldberg used to love talking about that. Uman di Omar. The Gemara asks the following question. There's a man that says also that Beit Shammai continued to follow in their path of their great Rebbe, and they were miyabim soras erva. Arinon kan lotis godudu, lotasu agudos. Meaning we're back really to Reish Lakish's objection, because now you talk about a case where the halacha was paskined like Beis Hillel, and yet Beit Shammai continue in their ruling, in their understanding of the Torah, and they paskin that at Soras Erva will be Misyabes. That's according to Madi Amar also. And that's Rabbi Yochanan. But what about the violation of Lotus Godu? Could you imagine that the Torah is split into two? There are those who say that it's Soras Erva, it's Misyabes, and those who say it's an Erva of Eishesach, it's Mamzeros. Amar Abaye, when we apply the principle of the Isur of what? Of Lotus Godu, Kigon Shtei Batei Dinim Be'ir Achas. When you divvy up the same city into two halves, Halolu, Matirim, Halolu, Osrim, etc., that's a violation of Lotus. Halolu morim kidire Beit Shammai, halolu morim kidire Beit Hillel. Aval shtei batei dinim b'shtei ayoros leslan ba. This is a radical departure and a revolutionary understanding of Lotus Godu of Abaye, in which Abaye says that every year, every city has its own independent status, and there'll be a psak and a horah for each city. Like, for example, here in Israel, we have something called the Rav Ha'ir. He is the final determiner of halacha in the city. Could be in the other city next door. There's another Rav Ha'ir came to the exact opposite conclusion. That's acceptable. Every city will generate its own horah according to Abaye. And kach noagim, and it could have a minute. But within the same city, that's already Lotus Godu. To have two Batei Dinim, and this Bezdin here paskins this way, and this one paskins that way, that's unacceptable. Now, how does that work out in Israel today? In the modern state of Israel, I don't know. You could have a Sephardic Bezdin on one corner, and on the other corner, across the street, next door, there's an Ashkenazic Bezdin. That'll come to a different conclusion. And now it became almost commonplace to open up a Bezdin with your own Morei Horah. So, for example, I live in Arnof. In Arnof, there's a Bezdin of Rav Reuben, and he has his own definite Bezdin. In Ramot, there's a Bezdin of Rav Weiss, so they opened up their own Bezdin. They put out a shingle, and they have their own Horahs. Is that not Lotus Godu? Amalei Rava says, "Vaha Beit Shammai Beis Hillel kishtei batei dinim b'rachasei." Are you telling me that the minhag of the Talmidim of Beit Shammai and the minhag of the Talmidim of Beis Hillel were in two different cities? That's not so. Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel both sat in the same city, and they had their own respective batei dinim. And nevertheless, according to Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, the Talmidim of the Bezdin of Beit Shammai continued in their ways to be matir and implement Yibum of the Tzoras Erva. Whereas in another Bezdin in the same city, they continued the tradition of Hillel, and the Beis Hillel were prohibiting Yibum of a Tzoras Erva. Why is that not a violation? So Rava therefore believes that we have to reinterpret the Isur and the application of the Isur of Lotus Godu. Here I'm reading Lotus Godu, who says Rava Kigon Bezdin Be'ir Achas Peleg Morim Kivdivrei Beit Shammai, Upeleg Morim Kivdivrei Beit Hillel. But they did Berachas Leslan. So first we'll translate Rava literally, but honestly, we're going to have to work very hard to understand Rava. Rava envisions the lav of Lotus Goledu as addressing a scenario in which the judges, the dayanim, within the same bezdin are divided. And that generates different psak, different oros. And you're splitting up the same exact bezdin. If you have two batei dinim like that of Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai in the same city, Rava holds that that's not Lotus Goledu. Every bezdin has its right and its obligation to be Mora Hora. But when one bezdin is split into two, that's something which violates Lotus Goledu. Now, how do we understand Rava? Every bezdin has to be omei l'minyan. They have to decide a ruling based on majority rules. Again, there are certain different dinim and momenos and nefashos, how much majority you need and how many dayanim you need. But it's hard to imagine a situation of plag bezdin, a plag morin kedivrei Beis Hillel, plag morin kedivrei Beis Shammai. How do you imagine? Now, perhaps we can come through a back door here to understand what's going on. The back door is, let's go back, rewind to Reish Lakish's kasha from Megillah, which the Gemara doesn't seem to address. It somehow got lost in the shuffle of it. In Megillah, we had those who read on Yudalit and those who read on Tesvav. And that's the subject of this Tosas key, which is, I think, the third Tosas, fourth Tosas down on the page. Now, watch what happens. The Mishnah at the beginning of Megillah establishes that there are, how many days? Let's say Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, 3 days for the Kfarim, the Bnei Kfarim, depending on when Monday and Thursday falls out, what we call the Yom HaKnis. Now, the Bnei Kfarim come into the big cities in order to hear Megillah. So when they come in on, let's say, Yud Aleph Adar is on a Monday. So they come in, and we're going to read the Megillah on Yud Aleph. And in that same city, at least, I don't know about the same bezdin, we'll have to see, the Bnei Ayaros will not be allowed to read the Megillah until Yud Aleph, and the Krachim, until Tesvav. So I'm not sure I think that this kasha is going back to Abaye. Let me just see if I'm right. Give me a minute for a second. Ki amrina lotus goledu is b'shei batei dinim be'erachas. Oh, very good. Tosa is asking a kasha on Abaye, because Abaye says that if you have two different batei dinim in the same city, that's a problem of Lotus Goledu. And certainly in the case of Megillah reading, where the Bnei Kfarim come in from the villages into the cities on Yud Aleph, and they, in that same city, are splitting the city into two minhagim. So Tosfos is so bothered by this question that he comes to the opposite conclusion, that the Bnei Kfarim read the Megillah in their villages. They did not read the Megillah on Yud Aleph Yud Beis Yud Gimel in the city, but rather in their home villages. And Tosfos proves this from a Yerushalmi. The Rosh, on the other hand, assumes that the Bnei Kfarim read the Megillah on Yud Aleph Yud Beis Yud Gimel in the cities. Says the Rosh, El Shalo Haya Ben Ir Korei Lahem Kim Korei Li Atzma. One of the Bnei Kfarim, one of the villagers, when he came in on Yud Aleph to the big city, he would have to read the Megillah on behalf of his fellow landsman, as we call it, from those Kfarim. Okay, this is going to help us for Rava, because Rava says that the only problem of Lotus Code is within the same bezdin, but you can have two different Batei Dinim, according to Rava, within the same city, and that's not Lotus Code. So the Rosh is clearly assuming that the Bnei Kfarim would read for themselves within the ear, and they form a bezdin. So we have now, at least according to Rava, a solution to the problem of Lotus Goda, because we have two Batei Dinim. It's not plag bezdin. However, Rashi Megillah goes on record as to say that the Bnei Ayoros would read the Megillah on behalf of Bnei Kfarim, which basically means that the Bnei Kfarim, pardon the expression, were Amaratzim. At that time, they couldn't read the Megillah on their own. They had to wait until they came into the city, and they would hear the Megillah reading from the city, one of the city slickers, who was a scholar, so to speak, and could read the Megillah on their behalf. So in which case, it's basically one bezdin split into two. Chasav Rabbi Kivei. John, are you able to follow this? I always forget which Gemara you have. So we're looking, if you have the Gemara Chelik Aleph of Yevamot, you're on Yud Dalid Amud Aleph, and in brackets it'll say Beis. And we're on line 4 in the footnote. The Katzav Rabbi Kiva Eger, she'ein kavanosu l'kach shebnei hakfarim yotzim b'kriyasa shel bnei ha'ir midin shomei ha'omer elahu eino ela makri b'fneim ve'en onim achrov b'fiem. Says Rabbi Kiva Eger, they would read it along word for word with the shots. The shots was one of the bnei Ayoros. He would say, Vayehi, and they would say Vayehi. And why does that solve that problem of Lotus Code? I don't know, but that's what we want to figure out. I don't know if you remember, in my youth, there was a television program called Sing Along with Mitch. I don't know if you remember. I'm really dating myself. So according to Rabbi Kiva Eger, the tzibur of the Bnei Kfarim, who are now in the city, on either a Monday or a Thursday for the business days, they would sing along with Mitch. In other words, one of the Bnei Ayoros would read the Megillah, they would read it responsively, word for word. So how does that solve that problem? Is therefore, he says, there's no Shomea Ka'onet. Elahu Einom Ela Makri B'fneim Behem Onim Achrov, meaning Teva B'Teva BPM, the Yotzim Yedei Kriyas Atzma. Interesting. Rabbi Kiva Eger understands that agudos, according to Rava, which means splitting a bezdin into two, would only apply if the Bnei Ayoros are reading on behalf of the Bnei Kfarim through the principle of operating through the principle of Shomei Ka'od. So that, in a sense, the Bnei Ayoros are participating in the Megillah reading, but yet they have to read their own Megillah reading on the 14th. So they're already dipping into this, same Bezdin, so to speak, of reading it on Yud Aleph Yud Beis Yud Gimel. But if, on the other hand, we're not operating with Shomei Ka'ona, but rather they would read it along the Bnei Kfarim together with the shots, then the Bnei Hayoros are nothing more than like a human tape recorder, so to speak. You know what I mean? It's just to transmit the words of the Megillah and wake them up so they know how to read the Megillah and say the words on their own. So there's no participation in a halachic sense. Again, it'll look identical. Well, not exactly. Maybe I went too far because it'll look different when they repeat it. But it's halachically fundamentally different. And then he quotes the Ramban. Even if we assume that the Bnei Ayoros read on Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, Mikamakom, Hayu Muvdalim v'Korim Sham B'fnei Atzmi. Well, that's a tough. Muvdalim v'Korim Sham B'fnei Atzmi. I don't know. There must be a long to see it to this. Okay. Toshma. Now the Gemara raises another issue with regard to Shabbos, which seems to violate the prohibition of Lotus Golden. Toshma b'mokom b'mkomo shel Rabbi Eliezer, but you karsim eitzim lasos pamim b'Shabbos, lasos bars. So we're talking about Milah b'Shabbos. The Torah says that Milah on the 8th day overrides Shabbos. And Rabbi Eliezer was the Tana who held that even Machshirei mitzvah override the Shabbos. Not only the actual cutting of the Milah, but even if I need wood in order to burn a fire so that I can sterilize the ismol of Milah, that's called Machshirei Milah. You're allowed to do this on Shabbos when Shabbos is the 8th day of Milah. So you go down and you cut trees, you burn the trees, they become chamim. Chamim, I guess, are coals, charcoals. And your whole purpose is to create a barzel. Barzel, which literally means metal, but here in this context, it means an ismol, a knife, for milah. This is the famous shita of Rabbi Eliezer's entire Perek in Shabbos, named after this Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer the Milah, who he maintains that Machshirei Milah are dochet Shabbos. B'mkomo shel Rabbi Yossi, yayu ochlim b'sar of bechol. So not only in the location of Rabbi Eliezer, they would violate Shabbos of Milah with Machshirei Ochel, Machshirei Milah. In the place of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, they would actually cook chicken with milk. I mean, again, it sounds, how can you do such a thing, right? But that's what they did in Rabbi Yossi HaGlili's Gegin. In his areas, he paskined that that oaf is not included in Gedid, the Tosas Solspachel Gedid. And therefore, you could take chicken and cook it with milk. Gegas of the and they went and they did that in the makom of Rabbi Yosef. Now let's see the diuk of the Gemara. B'mkomo shel Rabbi Eliezer in. When would they allow to sharpen these knives or heat up these knives and cut the wood and all that stuff that's in the Makomo Shel Rabbi Eliezer? But those who rejected Rabbi Eliezer, which means Makomo Shel Rabbi Akiva, he held that there's no heter, the Torah did not permit machshirei mila on Shabbos. Disnan klalam Rabbi Akiva kol malach shef shel asosa me'erev Shabbos eina doches haShabbos. So you could have easily cut down these trees on Erev Shabbos. You could have taken the trees, burnt them into coals, created a fire, and then created the Ismail on Erev Shabbos. So when you have Efshal Asosim V'Vod Yom, Erev Shabbos, it's not Docha Shabbos, even according to Rabbi Akiva. So now we have a real serious question. In the Makomo Shel Rabbi Eliezer, they were matir krisas eitzim for mila as machshir mila. In the Makomo of Rabbi Akiva, you aren't allowed to do such a thing. Isn't that a case of agudos? So, by the way, this is not a case of Beisil Beit Shammai. This is a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. I mean, we pointed out that in the case of Beisil Beit Shammai, there was a baskol, and yet Beit Shammai were mechadedei tfei, they were sharper. And that seems to be a very unique feature of a machlokas between Beisil Beit Shammai. I don't know if you can, extrapolate and universalize from that to every single machlokas tanoim and speak about Lotus Golden. So the Gemara answers, "Hi, my tuvta." The mekomos shiny. In other words, we already established that if you have different minhagim reflecting different piskei halacha in different makomos, it's not one bezdin that's split, then there's no violation of Lotus Golden. So here is a case where you have different minhagim in different places that reflect different shitos. This is not Lotus Golden. So the Gemara says, "U'dekarele my karele." So why did you even ask this question? I mean, the answer is so obvious. You were comparing apples and oranges. Salkadait, the Gemara answers, "Mishum chumra de Shabbos kemokom echadam komashmalon." So this I don't understand. What does chumra de Shabbos have to do with Lotus Golden? I don't know. You have anything, maybe, Jeff, in your notes over there on this line of the Gemara? Shum Chumra de Shabbos? What does he say? You don't mind if I could trouble you?
Sabbath laws are especially stringent in this purpose. Intentional violation carries the penalty of death.
Okay. Why is that relevant?
One of the benefits of photos and disrespect for Allah. Very practice. In the case of Sabbath laws, since they are exceedingly stringent, it's necessary to avoid even the slightest grounds of disrespect. Based on Bo Tizadu, we should require uniform observes of Sabbath law, even
Does he tell you who he's quoting?
and yeah, there's Mishnah and and Shabbos. That's just.
It's apparently a Mishnah Berurah.
So then he goes on. He says, therefore, two courts, the courts of Rabbi Lazar and Akiva, in two different towns should be treated as though they were both.
Right. Because of the Chum of Shabbos. But let me just summarize in my own words what Jeff is reading here, which is probably based on the Mishnah Berurah, and that is that we have to be very careful about Lotus Godedu in a commensurate to the Chumash Ha'isa. I mean, in the case of Shabbos, dealing with the fee of Skila. And therefore, as soon as you allow these people to do that on Shabbos, and those people know it's asur, for the people who think it's asur because they pass like Rabbi Akiva, the Machshir Vilanato Shabbos, they get very laid back about it when they see here that they're cutting down trees for the sake of preparing pchamim. It leads to a situation, he calls it zilzul. I was going to use a different word. Anyway, when you lower something in the eye, something that should be very high up with a great deal of respect, and you lower the respect for that. So the Gemara thinks that it could be that the Makshad here thought that even though, the places of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer was separated one from the other, they were in different locales, and each one was Makomos. And therefore there would be no Lotus Godedu. The Gemara thinks, no, this is like Makom Echad. The word is going to get out that here they're doing such and violating the Shabbos, and it's going to create a certain lenient attitude towards Shabbos, laid back attitude. So let's see if we can fit in just one more Tashma. The Rabbi Avo, he ikla le'asrei, the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, when he ended up in the locale of Rabbi Yeshua, havimitaltel shraga. There was no Iser Muktzah. We have machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about Muktzah, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi apparently accepted the shita of Rabbi Shimon, the Leslie Muktzah, and therefore Rabbi Avo was very careful that when he found himself in the Gegen, in the area, the locale of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he would treat Muktzah the way Rabbi Shimon would treat Muktzah, because that's the accepted halacha in the area of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So therefore, let's say you are madlik a ner, and you put X amount of a volume of oil in the ner, and the ner is the receptacle that holds the oil. And at some point during Shabbos, the candle was extinguished. So he's got extra oil. That oil is not mukt. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon rejects mukt against Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Shimon ben Levi, in his Gegen, he accepted the psak of halacha like Rabbi Shimon. And therefore, Rabbi Avo, in compliance with the local Rav, that's Rabbi Shimon ben Levi, would be metaltel a shraga, a ner, that was lit for that Shabbos, and it was extinguished. V'chi ikla li'asrei Rabbi Yochanan. And when the same Rabbi Avo found himself in the locale of Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan paskins lechumra like Rabbi Yehuda, the islay muktzah, and therefore the shemen shebener, Moshe shemen shebener, is muktzah. Now here the Gemara wants to know, how can you change a minhag from one place to the other? I mean, that should certainly be Lotus Godedu. So the Gemara says, "Hi, my kusha." Again, I don't understand your objection. The chilo amrina makomo shiny. We've already established that in two different places there's no lotus go. So you're talking about Asrei to Rabbi Yochanan, you're talking about Asrei to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, those are makomos. So why are you objecting here? What's your kasha? That there's a violation of lotus go. So Gemara answers, Anan hachi kamri. This was the intention of our kasha. We were focusing our attention on Rabbi Yavo, on he himself, that Gav. Hechi ovid hacha hachi vehechi ovid hacha hachi. How's it possible that in one makom he was knowing like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and in Lahatir, and in another makom he was knowing like Rabbi Yochanan Lahachmir? If it's also, then it's also everywhere under the sun. You can't tell me that here it's also and there it's mut. You can tell me that there are different minhagim that arose in different makomos based on the different rulings, but you can't, belong to both camps. You can't vote for the left and for the right. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Avok, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he really holds that according to the strict letter of the law, there is no Isur Muktzah in there, because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was his Rebbe to paskin like Rabbi Shimon that there's no Muktzah. But Mikol, Yasri, Rabbi Yochanan had a deference to the respect and of the Morad Asri, Rabbi Yochanan when he was in his neck of the woods, is Lo Avi Mitalto Mishum Kvodo de Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara asks, "Va'ika Shama." Shama is the Oizbach, what we call in Yiddish. So Rabbi Yavo had he had his sermon, and this is going to cause a zilzal in the eyes of the shaman, because he sees that when his Rebbe, or his master, I should say, Rabbi Yavo, finds himself in the Gegen of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's Matir Tiltu Anir. And he's going to come to the conclusion that even in the Makom of Rabbi Yochanan, you can be Matir Tiltul Shulber. He's not going to pay any attention to the kavod of Rabbi Yochanan. Our answer is the Modal Leilucham. We can rely on Rabbi Yavo that he will notify his shamish and straighten him out and tell him that even though Mikra Din, you're allowed to be metal to the Ner Shraga, but when you find yourself in the locale of Rabbi Yochanan, you have to be very careful and resist being metaltel or desist from being metaltel the Shraga because of the covenant of Rabbi Yochanan. So let's just see where we get up to. Toshma Afalpi. We'll pick it up tomorrow, which is Yom Shlishi, right?